Hello everyone, Super Mackie here, and this is my first video in quite a while, really. I haven't been able to upload much, but I'm working on that, and this is kind of a first taste, you could say. It's actually kind of an improvisation based on a tweet that's been making the rounds. It's a video, actually, about Ray Bradbury, the writer, talking in the 70s about the space age. It's really quite interesting. I'll put a link to it below. It came up in my For You tab, so I don't really follow this guy or anything. But the content of the tweet itself, I liked it. And I do like Ray Bradbury as an author. The Martian Chronicles is one of my favorite novels. And recently, anyway, I've been rereading some of Fahrenheit 451, just because of the climate we're in nowadays. But anyway, the reason I'm making a video on him is because he links to the point of this whole channel, which is Disney. And he was actually Ray Bradbury, he was actually quite close to Walt Disney back when he was alive. I mean Ray again, of course. He was close to Walt Disney during his life, and to the Disney company after Walt's death. So he's very much a core figure in the Disney story. Actually, I think he's even a Disney legend. I have to make sure of that. Okay, well, he isn't. That's odd. But anyway, the point is, Ray Bradbury was a very big Disney fan. Actually, he called himself a Disney nut. So this guy, he actually grew up watching Disney shorts and Disney features as they released, right? So he actually watched Skeleton Dance as it came out in 1929, and then he went on to watch all the symphonies and the Mickey Mouses and Snow White and Fantasia and so on and so forth. So he was very much a Disney original, right? And then, of course, he grew up to be a celebrated writer in the 50s. So he was coming out with The Martian Chronicles and, again, Fahrenheit 451, and a bunch of other short stories and magazine articles. Like, he was very busy in the 50s and 60s, just writing about the future, science fiction, these new ideas that were starting to come up in the world, technology, the space age. It was a very optimistic time, really, and this is something that he shared with Walt, right? So the story is he meets Walt in the streets of Los Angeles in the early 60s, and they recognize each other, one being Walt Disney, right, and the other being a famous writer. And Walt actually, he invites Ray over to his office, and they just start talking for hours about, about life, about technology, about the future, right? They have a lot of shared philosophies, especially at this point, like by the 60s. Walt, how should I put this? He was becoming more known for being a futurist, like a technology guy, like an urban designer kind of guy, than he was known for being the creator of Mickey Mouse. Well, of course, people knew him as the Mickey Mouse guy, but it wasn't as important to him at that point. Like, it's almost like when Steve Jobs died, the first thing people thought about was, well, this is the guy that made the iPod, or the iPhone. But he was also the guy who made the Mac, right? Way back in the 70s. But he had gone so far that we associated him more with his recent creations. And the same thing with Walt, right? Like, at this point, by the 60s, he was working on new attractions for Disneyland, new worlds, new theme parks over in Walt Disney World in Florida, and the big one was the City of Tomorrow, the Epcot, or the original Epcot. That was to be a whole city, right? So he found a lot of, I guess you could say, common ground with Ray Bradbury, who was also very much a busy person, right? Like he was writing screenplays for movies and plays, right? I should say screenplays. He wrote scripts for movies and plays, all right? And so he was actually he actually wrote a couple science fiction films in the 50s. What were they again? Let me just check here. So a couple science fiction movies like Moby Dick and It Came from Outer Space. So really his wheelhouse of films, like cult classics by this point. And so he was always doing something, and so was Walt. And they kind of bonded over that. They called, or at least Bradbury, he called it optimal behaviorism. And what he meant by that was, if you behave well, you end up feeling well. And by behaving, he meant doing something.
You get your work done every day, and at the end of a week, a month, a year, you turn around and say, hey, look what I did. So you feel good. That's real optimism, optimal behavior. So that's, I think, the way he behaved.
Right, so always making it so that you can look back on like a day or a week or a month, and you can say, yeah, I did something in those weeks or whatever, right? It wasn't really like he was advocating being busy for busy's sake, but he was advocating being busy so that you could have something to look back on, right? So just doing things. And I've kind of come to live by that, really. Doing things so that I could say I've done them. I could be happy of doing something. And that's actually why I'm making this video in the first place, because it kind of rocked me a little bit. Like I should be working on things, right? And so back to our two protagonists here. Bradbury and Walt, so they were actually close enough that Walt would show Bradbury around the studio and around the Disneyland theme park, showing him movies in development and attractions like the Pirates of the Caribbean. It was being worked on at this point. He would actually show Ray Bradbury the Mr. Lincoln animatronic that was being worked on for Disneyland. Now, it was, of course, at the World's Fair in 1964, and then Disney took it back and repurposed it to work at Disneyland. And so these were actually two close friends, right? And it actually went further than that, right? So back in the late 50s, Disneyland was being, what's the word for this? I guess criticized by some people, by some intellectuals actually, as low art, a low art kind of thing, like almost like Las Vegas, believe it or not, like very much against the idea of a theme park. And Bradbury was one of the intellectuals who took exception to this. So he actually went to Disneyland quite a few times before meeting Walt, right? Again, he was a huge original Disney fan. There was this magazine called Travel. Was it Travel? No, Holiday magazine. And they had an article in it that was very much critical of Disneyland, right? As being mass media kind of thing, consumerist or whatever. And Ray actually found enough of an issue with it that he wrote a letter to the editor about this thing, right? Like he was actually not impressed by the slander that he saw. And he was very much a Disney fan, and he enjoyed Disneyland, and he felt that a lot of the stuff in the magazine were not true. So even before meeting Walt personally, like, he was actually out there defending the things that his company was working on, right? And of course, within reason, right? He wasn't like a fanboy or anything. Like, he was objective. Like, he actually really did think of Disneyland as the ideal place, right? And that's another thing. At this point in time, Disneyland was seen as a major cultural achievement and an architectural achievement, right? It was like being inside of it was like a different world. Like, nobody had ever seen this before. And naturally, you have some people were, very much against that. It's just opinion, really. But a lot of people were also for that. Like, we take it for granted today, but back then it was a huge cultural touchstone, right? So anyway, these two guys, they're believers in the philosophy of always doing something. And Walt would actually, talk to Ray a lot about his plans for the future, right? Like again, the big one at this point was the city of tomorrow, like a whole different city, a whole artificial city, just to kind of try out new concepts and techniques. Like, this is next level stuff. Unfortunately, Walt died before it actually got off the ground, but it left enough of an impression that the Disney company, well, they canceled the city, of course, but they ended up making a permanent World's Fair over at Walt Disney World. And they actually got Ray Bradbury to write the introduction to the theme park, to Epcot, the one that plays in Spaceship Earth, right? So he was actually consulted on that attraction and a bunch of other things too. Like, after Walt died, he actually wrote a number of Disney movies. The most notable one being a movie adaptation of one of his novels, Something Wicked This Way Comes. So he actually wrote that. It didn't come out so good because, studio factors. It was very much, it was a weird one, I'll tell you that much. But he wrote it. That still counts as collaboration. And then a few years later, he would write another odd movie. What was it? The Wonderful Ice Cream Suit, a comedy, a direct-to-video comedy. So it's kind of an offbeat one, but it was just another example of the connections that Ray and the company continued to have after Walt's death. As a matter of fact, there's actually a tree over in Disneyland, I think it is, called the Halloween tree. So Ray actually wrote a book called The Halloween Tree in the 70s. And there's a tree right now that appears around Halloween. Or maybe it's decorated around Halloween. But the point is, there's a Halloween tree over in one of the Disney parks that's specifically a tribute to him. So he has major clout, you could say. But yeah, for me, again, seeing that video on Twitter, it kind of reminded me, like, of this philosophy that Bradbury and Walt, they shared so enthusiastically, right? This theme of always working on something, right? And it sounds like it's advocating burnout or whatever, or like overworking, but it's not. That's a different thing. This is kind of the value of working on things that you think are valuable, right? So for me, it is this video, or like the inspiration to create more videos, right, after a long hiatus. And I really believe in that, and that's something that I read a long time ago. Like, I've known about this for like years, right? I've known about the Ray Bradbury thing for years. But it's always good to have reminder of why you're doing things, right? And the last thing I'll end on is really the idea that or the passion that these two men had for the future, right? So at this point, like I said earlier, Walt was a futurist very much, and he had this whole TV show presenting new concepts and possibilities, educating America on what could be done way in the future, right? And then you had Bradbury himself here, whose whole living was being based off writing about the future and predicting things and stuff like that. Like Fahrenheit 451, it predicts a lot of technology that we use today, right? Like flat screen TVs, for example, to name one, right? I can't name them all off the top of my head. But the point is, it's just interesting thinking about a time where it was in vogue to be almost naively optimistic about what the future held in terms of technology and architecture and stuff. You know, we hear today about making cities more walkable, more livable, less car dependent. That was actually a big part of Epcot, about Walt's original ideas for his city that we never got to see. So it's just it's kind of a what if scenario, you know, like what if these concepts that these guys were working on ended up being done, right? And we did end up getting the permanent World's Fair in Walt Disney World, so it wasn't all bad. And we did end up getting some Ray Bradbury contributions to Disney, and he is a solid part of Disney history. So I believe in the future I'll have a more produced video of Ray Bradbury and his Disney connection, but for now I'll just leave it at him and Walt were great friends. They thought very much the same way, and they shared a philosophy that I try to live by. I don't always live up to it, but I try my best. So anyway, that's the end of my conversation here. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Like I said, I hope to start uploading videos soon, and I'll have a lot more Disney content for you to see. So yeah, thanks for watching, and have a good day.